Okay, so happy Friday to everyone. We're going to do a quick week that was and a week that will be, and then we'll cover off on the Omnibus Bill with a quick update. Interesting that next week, Dan, America goes to elections. I saw a classic statistic today that in the last election in 2016, if no votes were actually a vote, they would have won 430 of the 500, sorry, 470 of the 530 odd seats. So an interesting week ahead there. I think next week's going to be dominated in Asia Pacific by Thailand and perhaps Pakistan. But today we're going to focus on the Omnibus Law in Indonesia and how that's been affecting the situation. I might just get you to do a quick overview of the Omnibus Bill, Dan, in 2 or 3 minutes. Next slide. Thanks, Bhargav.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Yeah, the Omnibus Bill has been passed. It is now law. It amends 75 different laws in Indonesia. Its stated purpose is to, as it mentions in the slide, liberalize the business environment. But that's not its real purpose. Its real purpose is to re-centralize control over permitting with the central government. And almost every single provision or every single law that is amended by the Omnibus Law has a re-centralization of authority. This is a major change because in 2001, the government made a policy, a very important policy of distributing power to the regions. And this law reverses that. It could be called a return to New Order politics. And I believe a lot of the protests, especially by the leftists, are aimed at that particular issue, that it's a return to New Order politics. The changes to the 75 laws are mostly technical in nature. I would call them a big whoop. One for the mining law, for example, there's an increase in the size of the exploration area, etc. So you'd be hard pressed to find earth-shaking technical changes in the law. But you will find a few changes in the labor law, which is the focus of the protests. As it mentions in the slide, minimum wages may be affected. Temporary workers can be basically kept on a contract forever. But on the other hand, they also may get severance, depending on what the regulations say. There is a bit of a reduction in severance pay. But overall, if you weighed all of the changes, pro and contra employee in the part of the law that governs employee-employer relations, it would only be a slight tilt toward employers. Next slide, please, Bhargav. The protests in Jakarta have been fairly sustained, and they have been sustained primarily because at the beginning, in the first 2 weeks, there was a well-funded set of professional protests that had nothing to do with the law. They interviewed many people participating in the protests, and they verified that they were paid. They had never read the law. They had no idea what it said. And those protests occurred for about 2 weeks, very expensive. To get thousands of people at 100,000 rupiah a piece to show up to protests is expensive. And also the government was a bit annoyed by it, so it went to the funder of the protests. And it basically said that he would have serious problems if he continued to fund the protests, and he backed off. And one of his lieutenants, who's a former head of the military, did a complete about-face and said, I now support the Omnibus Law. The protests that are continuing are being continued by genuine protesters who are leftists. And there is a major leftist presence in Indonesia since the government has basically backed off of its anti-communist stance. And they are protesting about the environmental portion, which they say is a disaster for the environment. It really isn't. They're protesting about the impact on labor. It's not, as I mentioned, it's really not that big of a deal. And those probably will continue for a period of time. The government seems to be allowing them as long as they don't get out of control. And I believe that the Omnibus Law will not cause major rioting in Jakarta. However, the part of the law that takes away power from local governors and mayors has really not been, the effect of it has really not been felt. And that is going to be a major sticking point once the governors and the mayors realize that special autonomy has in effect been repealed. And that could cause long-term political disruption in Indonesia as those mayors and governors lose power and their powers to grant permits and therefore lose revenue. So the omnibus bill is a fact. It has caused some protests, but overall, it's passed through fairly smoothly. Paul, that's my 3-minute summary.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so obviously there's been significant protests in some areas, though not as widespread as we would have thought. In Jakarta, that includes hotspots like the DPR and Palace and Monas. Also in the regional areas, the DPRDs, the governor mayor, the region offices, various universities. As well as that, we've got specific sites in Jakarta, of course, the Presidential Palace, Istana Merdeka, the Arjuna Wijaya statue, House of Representative DPR building in the Constitutional Court. And you can see on that map there, we have both planned protest sites and ongoing sites. Thank you, Bhargav. Major sites that have been impacted countrywide fundamentally are mainly in Java, which is kind of ironic given that it's re-centralising power with Java. But of course, the poorer people just see this as immediately bad for them, even though it's actually good on the long term for encouraging foreign direct investment, and all people should be encouraged if foreign direct investment comes in, because it'll be easier to have jobs, because it'll be easier to employ people and less burdensome to remove them. There's a real paternal instinct in the employment laws in Indonesia, which makes it almost impossible historically. So this does wind some of that back. Also urban centres such as Makassar and Surabaya, and as well as industrial areas across the country. You can see the red flags there on that slide. It's quite a nice graphic. Thanks, Bhargav. Might get you to talk about the opposition to the law, Dan.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Yeah, as mentioned, there were professional protests, and then there are hardline, philosophically opposed protests by labor unions, student groups, and civil society. There are 3 basic labor unions that are involved, and of course, labor unions are not going to like any changes that are employer related, and they the labor unions here have been fairly clear that they don't want any changes. So they're not really negotiating with the employer side. The student groups is an interesting one. There is a generation gap that is coming to the fore in Indonesia that mirrors the one in the United States between the boomers and the millennials. And in fact, the strongest politician in Indonesia, Megawati, came out criticizing the millennials the other day, saying that, what have you done for our country? So that's an interesting social phenomenon that is being played out in Indonesia, as it is in other places, where the older generation is calling the tune and the younger generation feels it does not have a voice. Civil society is primarily environmental groups. There are some free speech advocates who claim that, that are tagging along, but primarily there's a protest about the environmental aspects of the law. As you mentioned in part in bullet 2, part of the opposition is due to the secrecy in the law's passage. The number of pages, I can say from the draft 1, I read the whole thing and read its various drafts that I could get from various sources. And provisions appeared and disappeared, and pages were added, and there were supposedly typos that were substantive in nature. And the final law is a little bit less employer friendly than the first draft was. So this is part of the way Indonesia does things, is they play footsie on the wording in the law until it finally comes out. That's really not that important. What's really important is when the regulations come out, because the government is given in the law extremely wide latitude to either make the law very, very business friendly or less business friendly. And there are 30 regulations that need to be adopted in order to implement the law, and we'll see those over the coming months. Opponents claim that the law undermines labor rights. Well, no. One thing that it did that is a very substantive change is severance is now has a priority in bankruptcy. And that is an important change because in the latest COVID-related economic troubles, 70% of companies did not pay severance.
Yes.
And many of them went bankrupt. And having a priority in bankruptcy is a win for labor. So undermining labor rights, I don't see it, frankly, reading the text of the law. Paul?
Excellent. I might get to the next slide there. I agree, Dan. Look, I think just covering off on some of the major groups that are involved in the Indonesian acronyms for those looking visually, but we're using the English for this presentation. The Confederation of Indonesian Trade Unions have been actively involved. National Association of the University Student Executive Bodies, the Alliance for the Workers' Movement, and of course the Congress Alliance of Indonesian Labour Unions, and groups that are trying to capitalise on anti-government sentiment and organise protests of the Save Indonesia Coalition, Islamic Defenders Front, and other fairly radical Islamist groups. And I think, Dan, there'd be all the usual players, and I think behind it you might like to comment on some of the individual dynamics going on within the political power beyond these known groups.
Yeah, what's very interesting in Indonesia, and since this is a security presentation, is that the Omnibus Law is really just a stalking horse. The Save Indonesia Coalition, or KAMI, is a new grouping of disappointed political opponents who used to be allied with Prabowo Subianto, one of which is the radical Muslims, and then there are the extremely wealthy Chinese businessmen who are part of a mafia, and they have funded this KAMI movement, and it is headed by a former general. And KAMI is trying very, very hard to get some to rally Prabowo's former PA 212, which was an Islamic movement, trying to rally those people for the election in 4 years. And they want their name up in lights, and that's why they're getting out on the streets and trying to pressure the government. Besides that, the Minister of Finance has decided that she is going to try and confiscate assets that were accumulated by the children of Suharto in the 30 years that Suharto was in power. And that is a background event that is also causing a lot of unrest in Indonesia. And you may see the Omnibus Law also being used by Cendana, which is the shorthand term for the Suharto children, using those protests in order to further their complaints against the government, which is trying to seize their overseas assets, which could number in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
All right, next slide. Thanks, Bhargav. Look, I think this is very interesting. And you mentioned on it before about the re-centralisation agendas of the actual omnibus bill, but of course, contradictory there is that Indonesia went through a period where it realised it's going to have continued unrest if the central government and the central power figures and oligopolies all were siphoning all the resources from the country back into Jakarta at the expense of the other 800 odd tribal groups, if we ignore the 200 or 300 extra tribal and language groups in Papua. So now the situation is autonomy was developed so that everybody had a fair say, and it was in line with the national Pancasila, which is a national ideology, and it was in line with the Indonesian ethos of Musyawarah untuk Mufakat, or basically consensus by long discussions. And now it's going back to how it used to be. And the more it gets centralised, the more it is easy for certain power brokers to work out how they can chop down all the orchard trees and grab all the fruit, and don't worry that the trees aren't there next year because my belly is full. So I think there's a real contradiction here in terms that it's going to be easier for FDI to foreign investment companies to get approvals, but it's going to come at a price of conflict, as Dan mentioned earlier on in the presentation. As those provincial authorities and mayors work out what's going on and their communities work out what's going on, that they've been hoodwinked through some hidden bills within a very complex omnibus bill, I think that's going to be a particularly interesting and potentially tumultuous outcome for Indonesia. I think, of course, there's also potentially that a lot of overestimates on what this is going to achieve. I mean, I've gone on record on stating that if you create a bill to reduce red tape, but if it isn't very clear, then it may not be as effective as people think. And also the investors are going to be looking at it and going, given all the other issues involving Indonesia's reputation as a destination for foreign investments and for business risk, perhaps this isn't achieving as much as people think. It's not offsetting enough risk to deal with all the ambiguity of other issues that Indonesia is famous for, notably corruption, extortion, changing of laws, community unrest, the use of communities to leverage advantage. And while there are some good issues, the severance pay issues have been reduced for the foreign investment companies so that they're not so outrageously broad. Indonesia is still an expensive place for what you get in the human skills, and particularly in the factory workers versus other countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, and even some, when you factor off the efficiencies of infrastructure, even Singapore. But Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam continue to probably be a lot less risk and a lot more efficient for foreign direct investors. And I don't see this as a game changer. Dan, do you see this bill as a game changer on the short, medium or long term?
Oh, no, I don't see this bill as a game changer at all. I see it as an incremental improvement that is mostly of interest to lawyers. However, I would like to say that this is a very interesting time in Indonesia, because this bill is a re-Javanese-anization of the government.
Yes.
The Javanese, who are represented by Prabowo and Megawati and Jokowi, are alarmed at the reduction in their power, and they want it back, and they want to be the ones that are nominating, just like they did when Freeport came in with the contract of work. They want to go back to that. Now, if you're a big foreign investor, there is a real opportunity to negotiate with the government now for contract of work like provisions or PSC provisions. Every single day I am seeing the government backtracking as fast as it can because it's in real financial difficulty. So this is a very, very good time to come with your wallet and negotiate a good deal in Indonesia. On the other hand, I've also heard people in the regions, ones who know what's going on, saying, sure, come on and get all your approvals from the Javanese and see what happens when you get to our Kabupaten.
That's,
This will be what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the massive communities, Freeport being the obvious example, where you've got 5 highland Melanesian tribes. When you look at just the Dani tribe, you're looking at a couple of million, I beg your pardon, a million odd people. And then you've got the other highland tribes, the Amungme, the Damal, the Nduga, the Akari, and then you've got the Komoro. People don't understand that when you've got that complex a mix, the same applies for the Dayaks in Kalimantan, but through all the mining sectors, there are communities that they're just simply not going to accept their resources getting taken for the benefits of not only the central government, but clearly for self-effacing politicians. So that community factor is something that Indonesia needs to be understood. But Dan, the other complexity, of course, is, in theory, all the UMDA laws are not going to be matched off because it requires community engagement. But in a way, The omnibus bills are trying to declutter bureaucracy, but of course all the UMDAL, which is the environmental process, which takes into consideration all community engagements, all environmental, all social status, mapping, etc. There seems to be a contradiction there, Dan.
Well, this is a really interesting, this is a very interesting issue too, and I'm just going to take one example. In the first draft of the autonomy law, let me step back. In the years following the autonomy law, the rights granted to local communities became more and more real, and to the point where local communities would be, without their consent, a project could not go forward. Well, the first draft of the Omnibus Law went back to the Suharto provision that basically gave the government the ability to resolve any land dispute about adat rights, which are traditional rights as to land, and basically come in as the central government and say, you will allow this project to go forward. That has been watered down in a little bit in the final draft, and we'll see what the regulations say. But the government clearly wants to go back to the New Order era, where the word of the central government was golden and that everything else fell into place. And whether they can do that or not, I don't know. They're supplementing it with some very interesting political dilution measures. They are going to split Papua into 3 to 5 provinces in order to isolate, basically isolate the separatist governor, who is currently the governor of Papua, and put in people who are friendly to the regime. And again, that's a throwback to the Suharto era, where ex-military were appointed to be bupatis and to be governors so that they could be an arm of the central government. I believe Indonesia is trying to go there, and the question is, how much resistance will they get from the local populations?
Well, it's interesting, Dan, because the Papuans often describe that process that you're saying we're evolving back to as community relations by superior firepower.
Well, 20,000 government negotiators with guns can't be wrong.
Okay, Bhargav, let's jump on, please. So, of course, what the result is from a security perspective is in Malang on the 8th of October, Jogja on the 8th of October, we saw a lot of use of really draconian measures by the police. We saw a lot of use of tear gas and fire cannons, and of course the nature of the protesters in Indonesia is such that they're often not very courteous or considerate, so it's easy to escalate violence. One thing that we must note here is if we look at, say, Hong Kong and compare Hong Kong to the unrest not only in Indonesia but also in Thailand, is there's a major factor where there's a difference, and that is the Hong Kong police are very limited in terms of their resources. Their training over the last 20 or 30 years simply didn't prepare them for what was the most obvious outcome, and that was China stating, one country, two systems is only something we're doing until we get our land that we leased out back. Obviously, a country of 1.5 billion people, that was never going to be a practical alternative. Ask anyone in Taiwan how that's going to unfold. But Indonesia and Thailand have very elaborate army and very elaborate police, and both are involved in internal, not external security. So one thing is that Indonesia, right or wrong, whether it's using Western-friendly processes, is of course not the case, but they do have a lot of capability to effect the use of power, not necessarily in a non-oppressive way, but whereas Hong Kong's actually struggling to keep a lid on it, if the Thailand and if the Indonesian governments decide to use their security forces, they're neither are afraid to use violence to get things under control. But of course, that led to Suharto's downfall in the late 90s. It led to just Jakarta in particular being totally out of control, total anarchy. But now the central powers in Jakarta, or the next generation, as Dan said, wanted to go back to the new order where it boils down to a few people and the surrounding oligopolies can benefit by a well-established process of corruption, nepotism, all empowered by incredibly well-matured greed. So, but in summary, though we're seeing some very high publicity, and we've got some graphics there, and go to the next slide, please, Bhargav, not only in Malang and Jogja, but also in Makassar and Jakarta. Makassar on the 23rd of October, Jakarta on October 8. We've seen a lot of arson, vandalism. We're seeing more and more blockading of roads. There's been clashes of security forces by the demonstrators. And as I mentioned, the use of tear gas and water cannons has been quite prolific and probably unnecessary. There's been a fundamental lack of patience and discipline. That's typical of how Indonesia deals with situations, that those with guns and tear gas think today that's the way, but they forget how that's going to affect their image and their ability to quell situations, because people prepare for violence with violence. Okay, Bhargav, let's jump on forward there.
Can I add one other thing, Paul? If I was dealing with security in Jakarta, my next thought would be bombings. And I believe that these highly vested interests that are being threatened financially offshore become more and more cornered, they have shown in the past that they will go beyond car burning and paying agents to fight the police, etc., to make their point. And I am sensing that, there are a lot of extremely, new order people who are being cornered. And the last time this happened, there was a lot of suspicion that bombings were funded by these interests, working in concert with the radical Islamists. And if you look at the Kami grouping, that's a formal grouping of those two interests: the Chinese mafia, the Cendana interests, and the Islamic extremists.
Yes, and of course, and indeed, it's not only possible, I'd say it's in the likely category, because as powers get re-centralized, of course, there's massive bags of gold there, and most of the politicians in Indonesia, with only extremely rare exceptions, are really in power for money. And of course, the bigger the money gets, the greater the battles are to control it by getting access to it. So yeah, good point, Dan. So look, just moving on to the short-term impact of the Omnibus Bill on FDI. Would you like to lead the way there, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Let's just look at a couple of things that are somewhat good. There are less sectors on the negative list. That's a positive, as it mentions. Unfortunately, many of those sectors still limit foreign ownership to less than majority. Nobody wants to own a minority stake in an Indonesian company. So it's a bit deceiving to say that it's been reduced off limits from 300 to just 6. There's been some slight opening, but in many sectors, they're still closed. Legal certainty for businesses, it's a little more certain than it was. There is a clearer online procedure for many licenses. Many licenses still require the intervention of a bureaucrat, which means you have to pay. The government's working hard to try and put everything online, but the ministries are resisting that because that's a source of funding for them. Fiscal incentives for corporations, that's very true. Sri Mulyani has done a very good job of trying to reduce taxes, reduce not only corporate taxes, but value-added taxes and tariffs, and trying to make the fiscal regime look attractive to companies. And it is attractive to companies. Indonesia has an excellent fiscal regime compared to its neighbors. The labor regulations have been revised. They're slightly better if you're in a labor-intensive industry. Yeah, you'd like them. They are better than they were, and they will cost you probably a bit less, although the minimum wage is still pretty high. Implementation, that will be the key. It depends on what the 30 regulations that are to be issued under this law look like. But I think they're going to look good because Indonesia's back is against the wall and they need foreign investment. And finally, the effectiveness of the reforms. I think companies will look at Indonesia, but I don't think until the regulations are issued and they are they expand what has already been done in the Omnibus Law, they will probably not incent major investment. However, if there is a major investor and they see the government, they're going to get a special deal. There's no doubt about it. And it's going to be probably a pretty good deal.
Okay, Bhargav. So look, on the long term, I'll start with this. I'll leave the last point there for you, Dan, but fundamentally the way I'm seeing it from a long-term perspective is Indonesia is very much inward looking. It's trying to tidy up its garden. But of course, when you look at that, there's so many competing factions, so many power plays, so many groups with self-interests. That's watered down the power of the original intent of the Omnibus Bill. I think they've struggled and are struggling. As you said, there's an incremental move forward, but it's not really offering some kind of competitive advantage. It's going to be really incentivizing a long-term success of dragging in foreign direct investment funding. There continues to be an over-reliance on investments that are expected to come in from China, and of course the China investments are one of your specialty areas. So I'll get you to cover off on that too, if you don't mind, Dan, because I think the whole issue with the Chinese is not only a geopolitical issue, but it's also an issue in driving the development of who's who in the power zoo in Jakarta.
Oh yeah, that's very true. The Chinese investment continues to come in. A major Chinese commodities investor just made a big investment in the state tin company in the market, and the Chinese have been given carte blanche to come into Indonesia. There's even a minister in charge of the Chinese whose name is Luhut Panjaitan. And the Chinese are going to dominate Indonesia for the foreseeable future, at least until the election. And if Prabowo wins, that may be pruned back a little bit, but at least in the short term, the Chinese companies will be given special treatment in order to come in. So if you're not a Chinese company and you got a lot of money, you might get a good deal. But if you're just a regular company that's trying to come in, you better understand the Omnibus Law and really look hard at where you are and what you're doing and what you hope to achieve, because you're not going to get any special treatment.
And look, if you're a massive company, a massive mining company, you've got clout, you're going to be looked after. There's obviously some insidious stories going around about how foreign-owned smaller companies have been dealt with and fundamentally had their assets seized under very salubrious claims. But it really is, you need to be big to operate in Indonesia. Is that a fair summation?
Well, I would say that on a previous call, I gave an example of an American company that was investing in the Natuna Sea that was a license to its drill plan was withheld, and they were told that they would never get the license and that they needed to turn that property over to an Indonesian company, basically nationalizing it. Well, now Indonesia is in the stage where they called that company back after they had closed their office, after they had seized their investment, after it had been transferred to an Indonesian company, and said, "Would you want to come back?" And
that's the point I was alluding to.
Yes, and in addition, they met with the U.S. government and they said, "We'd like American companies to invest in the Natuna Sea." So it's a confusing place, Paul, and,
yes,
you better be careful. But it's got a lot of potential, and it's had a lot of potential for the last 50 years, and I imagine it'll have a lot of potential for the next 50 years.
Potential not realized, of course, has another name, I think. But Bhargav, carrying on there if we could. Yeah, so look, I mean, there's some of the indexes, and it's interesting to see that when we look at the trend line, Indonesia's fairly flat. Other countries are making gains. Vietnam's had, jumps. Philippines, as you'd expect, just barely getting ahead of itself. Malaysia is making progress. India's fighting its own bureaucracy. Dan, any other analysis you'd like to draw off the FDI restrictiveness index?
Well, I would say that the source of this is the World Bank, and the World Bank, the World Bank deals with what's written and not what's done. So
Yeah.
I would say that red line for Indonesia, probably from 2010 to 2014 should go down, and then it may go back up again.
Yeah. Please, Bhargav, the next slide. So when we're looking at the outlook, I think we'd agree, Dan, that there's going to be continuation of unrest, but it's nothing that, going to be major impact to people. The usual situation. Keep away from the localised mayhem. Whilst it might look spectacular on the TV, it is localised, it is avoided, it's not being directed at Westerners or directed at Western companies. It's a local issue, steer clear, but we wouldn't be expecting that to change anytime soon.
No, not at all. I just drove by some tire burning the other day, and these guys are paid, and they are paid for particular acts. They're not like they were back in the 90s when if you drove by they might attack your car. Not at all. It's a paid protest.
Yeah, and Bhargav, do we know if Jokowi, has he actually signed the bill off yet?
No, Paul. He has not signed yet. He was expected to sign sometime this week. Earlier they said on Wednesday, then he postponed it. Still, he hasn't signed it yet.
It's unlikely he's going to sign it. He's just going to let it become law without his signature.
Yes. And obviously, despite there's a lot of political tools and players pulling on the strings behind the scenes, but fundamentally, our advice is strongly, as always, avoid protests. Be aware that you may have staff attending them if you've got, particularly low-paid blue-collar workers. Make sure you've got a policy and educating people to avoid them at all costs, understand the dangers, understand, as Dan alluded to, there could be planted IEDs, improvised explosive devices there. So, it is a bit of a messy situation, but on the scheme of things, it is very local, occupying only a small percentage of the territories available. Of course, in the major cities, Jakarta and Surabaya in particular, it's having a massive impact on traffic, but that's probably the greatest impact to everybody, unless you don't have a policy and get involved in the proximity dangers of these unrests that can turn violence, as you've seen on the graphics in this presentation. Dan, a closing comment for you on FDI. Has it been worth the effort for the Indonesian government?
The Omnibus bill has been worth the effort. It demonstrates some good faith. It demonstrates they're moving in the right direction.
Yes.
And it is a good thing, not a bad thing. But there's a lot more to it than is on the surface.
Yes, and that's obviously going to continue to be agile, as is other areas within Asia Pacific, and we might do another update, Bhargav, next week on Thailand, perhaps on Tuesday. Dan, look, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it very much. If you could stay on the line, please, Bhargav, could you halt the recording?